The universe, it turns out, has a rather twisted sense of humor. Take the Krythak Dominion, for instance, a species so convinced of their own superiority that they'd managed to convince half the galaxy to pay them protection money. Not that they called it protection money, of course. That would be crude. No, they preferred terms like stability contributions and peace maintenance fees, delivered with a kind of bureaucratic flourish that would make a tax collector weep with joy. For 3 centuries, the Krythak had perfected the art of civilized extortion. Their ships prowled the trade routes like metallic sharks, their diplomats spoke in measured tones about mutual cooperation, and their enforcers did what enforcers do best. The galaxy had grown accustomed to their presence, the way one grows accustomed to a persistent headache or the smell of burning circuits in an old ship. Station Omega-7 squatted in the neutral zone like a mechanical tumor, all jutting docking arms and flickering neon advertisements in 17 different languages. It was the kind of place where legitimate traders rubbed shoulders with smugglers, where information flowed as freely as the synthetic alcohol, and where everyone understood that asking too many questions was hazardous to one's health. The perfect place, really, for the Krythak to set up shop. Warlord Vex'hai commanded the local operation from his fortress embassy, a hulking structure that looked like someone had crossed a government building with a maximum security prison and forgotten to add windows. He was, by Krythak standards, a model citizen, ruthlessly efficient, utterly without conscience, and possessed of the kind of casual cruelty that made grown Zeltharians wet themselves. His reputation preceded him like a bad smell, and his collection of exotic torture devices was the envy of dictators across 3 sectors. The Krythak themselves were an impressive sight, standing nearly 8 feet tall with chitinous exoskeletons that gleamed like polished obsidian. They moved with the fluid grace of apex predators, their forearms ending in claws that could shred plasteel, their compound eyes missing nothing. Evolution had been kind to them, in the way that evolution is kind to things designed to kill efficiently. Which made it all the more amusing when the humans showed up. Humans, those bipedal oddities from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star, had burst onto the galactic scene with all the subtlety of a supernova. They were small by galactic standards, soft where others were hard, slow where others were fast. They lacked the Krythak's natural weapons, the Vorthak's psionic abilities, or the Zeltharian's toxic secretions. What they did have was an unsettling tendency to smile at inappropriate moments and an inexplicable fondness for pets that could kill them. The galactic community had watched humanity's expansion with a kind of bemused tolerance usually reserved for species heading toward inevitable extinction. They were, after all, clearly outclassed by virtually everyone else. Their technology was adequate but unimpressive. Their military doctrine seemed to revolve around controlled explosions, and they had the disturbing habit of naming their warships things like Angry Bee and My Other Ship Is Your Mom. Station Omega-7 had acquired a small human population over the past standard year, maybe 200 souls engaged in various forms of commerce, most of it legal. They kept to themselves mostly, ran a few shops, maintained a small clinic, and generally tried not to bother anyone. The Krythak barely noticed them, except when collection time came around. Humans, after all, paid their protection fees just like everyone else, if somewhat grudgingly. The market level of Omega-7 hummed with its usual chaos on the morning everything changed. Vendors hawked their wares in the perpetual twilight of the artificial environment, holographic advertisements flickered overhead in a dozen languages, and the air recycling systems worked overtime to process the exotic pheromones of 100 different species. It was, in other words, a perfectly ordinary day in paradise. 8-year-old Miko Chen picked her way through the crowd with the careful precision of someone who'd learned early that stepping on the wrong being's appendage could result in anything from a scolding to a diplomatic incident. She was small even by human standards, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of serious expression that suggested she took her shopping responsibilities very seriously indeed. Her guardian, Dmitri Kozlov, had sent her to pick up nutrient packs from old Vex'hai's stall, not to be confused with Warlord Vex'hai, though the coincidence in names had provided the station's residents with no end of amusement. Old Vex'hai was a Tholin trader who'd been hawking food supplies on Omega-7 since before most of the current residents had been spawned, hatched, or otherwise brought into existence. Miko found the elderly alien hunched over his scales, his arthropod legs trembling with age and what appeared to be fear. 3 Krythak enforcers loomed over his stall like black armored vultures, their compound eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "Payment is overdue, Tholin," the lead enforcer was saying, his voice carrying the particular tone that suggested he was enjoying himself far too much. "The Dominion's patience has limits." Old Vex'hai's mandibles clicked nervously. "Please, honored ones, the shipment was delayed. Pirates in the Kepler sector. I will have payment by next cycle, I swear on my clutch mother's shells." The enforcer's laugh sounded like grinding metal. "Next cycle. How convenient." He gestured to his companions. "Perhaps a demonstration of our displeasure will improve your memory." What happened next would later be debated in xenopsychology circles for decades. The enforcer raised his upper left arm, the one ending in serrated claws designed for maximum tissue damage, and brought it down in a casual arc toward the old Tholin's carapace. Miko Chen, all 4 feet and 6 inches of her, stepped directly into the blow's path. The claw that should have opened old Vex'hai's shell from crown to abdomen instead raked across the child's shoulder and chest, shredding her jacket and painting the market floor with entirely too much red. She hit the ground hard, rolled once, and lay still. For a moment, the market fell silent except for the eternal hum of life support systems and the soft patter of human blood on recycled metal flooring. Then old Vex'hai made a sound that no universal translator could adequately render, part keen, part howl, part prayer to gods that had stopped listening centuries ago. The lead enforcer stared down at the motionless child with the expression of someone who'd just realized he might have made a slight error in judgment. His companions shifted nervously, their compound eyes scanning the suddenly hostile crowd. It was an accident," the enforcer said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced himself. "The human youngling should not have interfered." A Zeltharian medic pushed through the crowd, her healing tendrils already extending toward the injured child. She worked in silence, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim concentration. Other beings pressed closer, forming a protective circle around the scene. "She is alive," the medic announced finally, though her tone suggested this was subject to change. "But she requires immediate surgery. The wounds are extensive." Someone in the crowd had already triggered the station's emergency medical protocols. Someone else had sent word to the human quarter. And someone, though no one would later admit to it, had made sure that Dmitri Kozlov received a very specific message about what had happened to the child in his care. The 3 Krythak enforcers backed away from the gathering crowd, suddenly aware that their usual intimidation tactics weren't having their desired effect. The beings of Station Omega-7 had seen their share of violence, but there was something about the sight of a child's blood that transcended species boundaries. "Despice," the lead enforcer commanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This is Dominion business. Return to your affairs." Nobody moved. If anything, the crowd pressed closer. In the human quarter of Station Omega-7, Dmitri Kozlov received the news with a kind of calm that experienced soldiers recognize as more dangerous than any amount of shouting. He listened to the stammered report from Marcus Webb, one of the local traders, his pale blue eyes never changing expression. "How bad?" Dmitri asked when Marcus finished. "Bad. Sesha's doing what she can, but..." Marcus shrugged helplessly. 3 parallel slashes across her chest and shoulder. If she'd been standing 6 inches to the left. Dmitri nodded once, a short, economical gesture. He stood from his chair, a movement that seemed to transform him from a middle-aged shopkeeper into something altogether more predatory. "Who?" "Krythak Enforcement Team. 3 of them. Led by Captain Thexmore, if the descriptions are accurate. And they report to Warlord Vex'hai. Same as always." Dmitri walked to his quarter's small storage locker and began removing items with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this many times before. A sleek black bodysuit that seemed to absorb light. A collection of devices that looked like they belonged in a museum of extinct torture methods but hummed with cutting-edge technology. A knife that was quite possibly older than some of the station's smaller moons and had definitely seen more action. "Dmitri," Marcus said carefully, "you know what they'll do if you go after Krythak personnel. This isn't like the old days. They've got a whole fleet in system." The older man paused in his preparations to look at Marcus with eyes that held approximately the same warmth as the vacuum between stars. "Marcus," Do you have children? Well, no, but then you wouldn't understand. Dmitri returned to his equipment. Miko isn't my daughter by blood, but she might as well be. Her parents died in the Proxima Colony incident. I promised her mother I'd keep her safe. He sealed the last of his gear into various hidden pockets and compartments, the kind of integration that spoke of extensive field experience. When he was finished, he looked like nothing more threatening than a middle-aged human in a dark jumpsuit. The effect was somewhat spoiled by the way shadows seemed to gather around him. What do you want me to tell the others? Marcus asked. Dmitri paused at the door. Tell them to stay out of the way. And Marcus? He turned back with something that might charitably be called a smile. Make sure someone's watching the council chamber feed. I have a feeling tonight's session is going to be interesting. The Krythak Fortress Embassy had been designed by someone with a deep appreciation for intimidation and a complete disregard for aesthetic sensibilities. It squatted in Omega-7's administrative sector like a metallic toad, all harsh angles and threatening protrusions. Its defense systems were supposedly impregnable, energy shields that could stop a frigate's main guns, motion detectors sensitive enough to track a Vorthak mouse, and guard rotations that never left the perimeter unattended. Supposedly, Dmitri Kozlov approached the fortress with the unhurried gait of someone out for an evening stroll, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression pleasantly neutral. To any observer, he appeared to be nothing more than a curious human taking in the local architecture. The fact that every security sensor he passed suffered a mysterious and temporary malfunction was surely just a coincidence. Human technology, it turned out, had a few advantages that hadn't made it into the standard galactic databases. Gravity-dampening fields that could fool motion sensors into believing a 200-pound human weighed as much as a dust particle. Neural scramblers that convinced surveillance AIS that whatever they were looking at was exactly what they expected to see. And good old-fashioned signal interceptors that could turn any security system into a helpful guide for when not to look. The fortress's main entrance was, predictably, heavily guarded. 6 Krythak warriors in full battle armor, armed with plasma rifles that could melt through ship hulls. They stood at attention with the professional alertness of soldiers who knew their jobs and took pride in doing them well. Dmitri walked past them without breaking stride. The side entrance was similarly protected, though with only 4 guards. They maintained a vigilance with admirable dedication, their compound eyes scanning every shadow, their weapons ready for any threat. Dmitri used the maintenance shaft instead. The fortress's interior was a monument to paranoid efficiency. Corridors wide enough for multiple Krythak to fight side by side, strategic choke points equipped with automated defenses, and enough redundant security measures to make a Terran intelligence officer weep with professional envy. Every wall was polished to a mirror sheen, every corner precisely calculated for maximum defensive advantage. It was also, Dmitri noted with professional appreciation, designed by someone who'd never had to deal with humans. Humans, unlike most galactic species, were persistence hunters. They might not be the fastest or strongest, but they had an unsettling talent for getting where they weren't supposed to be and staying there longer than anyone expected. They also had a distressing tendency to ignore the rules of engagement that more civilized species took for granted. The first guard Dmitri encountered was making his rounds with clockwork precision, his route taking him through the fortress's less critical sectors. He was alert, professional, and completely unprepared for someone who could move through shadows like smoke and strike with the calculated precision of a machine built for killing. The guard died without making a sound. The second guard met the same fate 3 minutes later, his body joining his comrades in a storage closet that wouldn't be checked for another 6 hours. Dmitri made his way deeper into the fortress, following memoized schematics and letting his equipment guide him past the more exotic security measures. He passed through corridors lined with the Krythak's idea of art, stylized depictions of conquest and domination that probably looked impressive to beings who appreciated that sort of thing. To human eyes, they mostly looked like very expensive ways to say we have no sense of humor whatsoever. The fortress's command center hummed with activity. Dozens of Krythak operators monitoring displays that tracked everything from shipping schedules to the dietary habits of the station's non-Krythak population. It was an impressive setup, the kind of comprehensive surveillance network that totalitarian regimes throughout history would have envied. Dmitri bypassed it entirely. Warlord Vex'hai's personal quarters occupied the fortress's topmost level, a suite of rooms that managed to combine luxury with defensibility in a way that suggested their occupant had never met a paranoia he didn't like. The walls were lined with weapons from a dozen different worlds. The furniture was crafted from materials that cost more than most beings made in a lifetime, and the view of the station through armored transparasteel was undeniably spectacular. The Warlord himself was reviewing reports at a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of some unfortunate moon. He was larger than the average Krythak, his exoskeleton bearing the scars of old battles and the kind of decorative scarification that indicated high rank. His compound eyes moved with the fluid precision of a predator evaluating potential threats, and his forearms managed data tablets with practiced efficiency. He looked up as Dmitri stepped out of the shadows, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation to contempt in the space of a heartbeat. "A human," Vex'hai said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone discussing an interesting but ultimately insignificant insect. "In my personal chambers." "How? Unexpected." Dmitri said nothing, simply stood with his hands at his sides and studied the Warlord with eyes that held no more emotion than a targeting computer. "I assume you hear about the incident in the market," Vex'hai continued, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight. "Regrettable, truly. But these things happen when inferior species interfere with Dominion business." "You're going to die now," Dmitri said conversationally. Vex'hai's laugh sounded like breaking glass. "Am I? And I suppose you're going to be the one to kill me? You, a soft little mammal from a backwater world whose greatest military achievement is learning to use fire." Dmitri tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "Your enforcers hurt a child." "My child. That was a mistake." "Your child." Vex'hai stood, his full height putting him nearly 3 feet above the human. The youngling interfered with legitimate enforcement action. "If anything, my people showed restraint in not killing her immediately." "Restraint," Dmitri repeated, tasting the word. "Interesting perspective." The Warlord gestured to the weapons lining his walls. "Do you see these, human? Trophies from 1,000 battles across 50 worlds. I have killed members of every major species in this galaxy, often with my bare claws. What makes you think a single soft-skinned primate poses any threat to me?" Dmitri's hand moved to the knife at his hip, drawing the ancient blade with a motion so fluid it seemed almost casual. "Because," he said quietly, "you've never fought a species that evolved from pack hunters who used to chase mammoths to death across frozen continents. You've never faced beings who spent 10,000 years learning to kill each other with sticks and stones, and who considered it an art form." Vex'hai's forearms spread wide, claws extending to their full length. "Pack hunters? Against a Krythak warrior? Your species' arrogance is almost amusing." "Pack hunters," Dmitri confirmed. "But here's the thing about humans, Warlord. We don't always hunt in packs. Sometimes, when something threatens our young, we hunt alone. And when we do that..." He shifted into a combat stance that had been perfected in 100 wars on a dozen worlds. "We become something else entirely." The fight that followed would have been over in seconds if Vex'hai had been facing any other species in the galaxy. Krythak warriors were faster, stronger, and better armed than virtually any opponent they might encounter. Their exoskeletons could turn aside most conventional weapons, their reflexes were enhanced by cybernetic implants, and their combat training was legendary throughout the known systems. Unfortunately for Vex'hai, humans had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to kill things that were bigger, stronger, and better equipped than they were. Dmitri moved like liquid death, his knife finding the gaps between exoskeleton plates with surgical precision. He used the Warlord's strength against him, redirecting killing blows into empty air, and turning Vex'hai's own momentum into weapons. When the Krythak's claws raked across his chest, tearing through his bodysuit, Dmitri simply smiled and kept cutting. "Impossible," Vex'hai gasped, green ichor spurting from a dozen wounds. "You're just a human, just a primitive." "There's something you need to understand about humans," Dmitri said, his voice never rising above conversational tones even as he systematically dismantled one of the galaxy's most feared warriors. "We're persistent predators. We don't give up. We don't show mercy to things that threaten our young. And we really, really don't like bullies." The Warlord's death throes destroyed most of the furniture in his personal quarters and left impressive gouges in the reinforced walls. When it was over, Dmitri stood over the corpse, breathing hard but otherwise unmarked except for the slowly healing scratches on his chest. He cleaned his knife with one of the Warlord's personal banners, then drew a small cutting tool from his equipment kit. The work that followed was neither pleasant nor particularly dignified, but it was necessary. When he was finished, he had acquired a trophy that would send a very specific message to anyone who cared to receive it. The Galactic Council chamber in Station Omega-7's governmental sector was, by design, one of the most secure locations in the neutral zone. Representatives from dozens of species gathered here to debate trade agreements, resolve territorial disputes, and generally pretend that civilization was more than a thin veneer over species-level violence. The chamber's architecture was carefully neutral, designed to offend no one while impressing everyone with the majesty of interspecies cooperation. Tonight's session was supposed to address routine trade issues, cargo inspection protocols, hazardous materials handling, and the perennially contentious question of whether Krythak dietary supplements should be classified as controlled substances. The representatives had filed in with their usual mixture of boredom and professional dedication, prepared for another evening of parliamentary tedium. They were not prepared for Dmitri Kozlov. The human appeared at the chamber's main entrance without fanfare, walking with the measured pace of someone who owned every meter of ground he crossed. He was still wearing his dark jumpsuit, though he'd made some effort to clean the worst of the green stains from the fabric. In his left hand, he carried something that might charitably be described as luggage, though luggage rarely dripped. The chamber's security team moved to intercept him, then stopped as their universal translators processed the identification he broadcast on open channels. Dmitri Kozlov, registered civilian, no outstanding warrants, full diplomatic immunity under the Terran Embassy Protection Act. He walked to the center of the chamber, where a circular platform allowed speakers to address the assembled representatives. The conversations that had been echoing through the space died as hundreds of eyes, stalks, senses, and other optical organs focused on the lone human. Dmitri set his burden down on the platform and stepped back. Warlord Vex'hai's severed head stared at the assembled representatives with compound eyes that would never see again. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that usually accompanies natural disasters or theological crises. Representatives from species that had spent centuries paying tribute to the Krythak Dominion found themselves re-evaluating their understanding of the local power structure. Honored delegates, Dmitri said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. I bring greetings from the human community of Station Omega-7 and a message regarding the treatment of our children. A Zeltharian delegate made a sound that might have been a whimper. Several others were reaching for their personal communicators, probably to alert their respective governments that the galactic status quo had just experienced a significant adjustment. This morning, Dmitri continued, 3 Krythak enforcers assaulted an 8-year-old human child. The child's crime was attempting to protect an elderly Tholin trader from extortion. For this act of compassion, she was nearly killed. He gestured to the head on the platform. Warlord Vex'hai was responsible for those enforcers. He expressed the view that harming human children was acceptable behavior, provided it served Dominion interests. The human smile was winter-made flesh. We disagree. A Krythak subcommander in the observer's gallery rose to his feet, his mandibles clicking with outrage. This is an act of war. The Dominion will not tolerate. The Dominion will tolerate exactly what we tell them to tolerate, Dmitri interrupted, his voice never rising above conversational tones. Your fleet is impressive, Commander. 57 ships, including 3 heavy cruisers and a command dreadnought. Quite capable of reducing this station to component atoms. The subcommander's compound eyes widened. That information was supposed to be classified. What your fleet is not capable of doing, Dmitri continued, is protecting every Dominion facility, every trade route, and every individual Krythak from the consequences of harming human children. Because you see, Commander, when you hurt one of our young, you don't just anger the local population. You anger all of us. He paused to let that sink in. Every human, in every system, on every world, and humans, as you may have noticed, have this annoying tendency to be everywhere. The chamber erupted in whispered conversations as delegates processed the implications. Humanity's expansion throughout the galaxy had seemed random, almost accidental. Traders here, colonists there, small communities scattered across hundreds of systems. It had looked like the natural diaspora of a young species seeking its fortune among the stars. Suddenly, it looked like something else entirely. The human community of Station Omega-7 has no quarrel with the Krythak Dominion, Dmitri said, raising his voice slightly to cut through the murmur of conversation. We are, by nature, a peaceful species. We prefer trade to warfare, negotiation to violence. But we have certain non-negotiable principles. He picked up Vex'hai's head by the remnants of its cranial crest. The safety of our children is one of them. The Krythak subcommander was frantically whispering into his communicator, probably alerting his superiors to the developing situation. Other delegates were doing the same, though theirs looked more like requests for instructions on how to avoid becoming collateral damage in whatever was about to unfold. The human community wishes to propose a new understanding, Dmitri announced. The Dominion may continue its operations in this sector under the following conditions. No Krythak personnel will approach within 10 meters of any human child without explicit parental permission. Any violation of this principle will result in immediate and permanent termination of the offending individual. Any Krythak commander who orders such a violation will share their subordinate's fate. He tossed Vex'hai's head to the Krythak subcommander, who caught it reflexively and immediately wished he hadn't. Consider this a gesture of goodwill, Dmitri said. We could have simply started killing Krythak personnel at random until someone got the message. This seemed more civilized. The subcommander stared at the head in his hands, his compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lights like fragments of shattered glass. You cannot be serious. The Dominion has ruled this sector for centuries. We are the strongest military force in known space. Dmitri corrected gently. You were the strongest military force. But strength is relative, Commander. The Krythak are strong because you fight other species who play by the same rules you do. Honor codes, formal declarations, civilized warfare conducted according to established protocols. His smile was the kind that carnivores used just before feeding time. Humans don't have honor codes when our children are threatened. We have hunting instincts refined over millions of years of evolution. We have technology you haven't seen yet. And we have absolutely no qualms about cheating. To emphasize his point, he activated a small device on his belt. Every screen in the chamber flickered to life, displaying tactical data that made several delegates emit sounds of distress. Ship positions, defense grids, command structures, personal information on key Dominion personnel. The kind of intelligence that should have been impossible for a civilian to obtain. We know where you sleep, Dmitri said conversationally. We know where your families nest. We know which stations you consider secure, and which worlds you think are too remote to threaten. We know because we're already there, Commander. We've been there for years, selling you supplies and fixing your equipment and watching everything you do. The implications hit the assembly like a physical blow. Humanity's seemingly random expansion wasn't random at all. It was a net cast across the galaxy by a species that understood the value of patience. But as I said, Dmitri continued, we're peaceful by nature. All we want is to raise our children in safety and engage in honest trade. Honor our simple request regarding our young ones, and there need never be any unpleasantness between our species. He turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and Commander, I'd recommend recalling your enforcement teams from the market level. The local traders are somewhat upset about this morning's incident, and they've been asking my colleagues for advice on how to express their feelings. We've been sharing some very interesting ideas about improvised explosives and pressure point anatomy. The human walked out of the chamber with the same unhurried pace he'd used entering, leaving behind an assembly of delegates who were rapidly recalculating everything they thought they knew about galactic politics. The Krythak subcommander stared at the head in his hands for a long moment, then activated his communicator with one of his free appendages. Command, this is Subcommander Thralvex. I need to speak with the Fleet Admiral immediately. We have a situation. In the medical bay of Station Omega-7, Miko Chen drifted in and out of consciousness, her small body wrapped in regeneration. fields and connected to more monitoring equipment than most small starships. Dr. Alexandra Petrov, another human expatriate, watched the displays with professional concern tempered by cautious optimism. "She'll recover," she told Dmitri when he appeared at the bedside, somehow having traded his blood-stained jumpsuit for clean civilian clothes without anyone noticing the transition. The Zeltharian healer did excellent work stabilizing her. Another few days in the regeneration matrix, and she'll be good as new. Dmitri nodded, settling into a chair beside the bed with the careful movements of someone who'd been in more fights than his body strictly approved of. He took Miko's hand in both of his, dwarfing her small fingers with his callous palms. "Uncle Dmitri." The child's voice was barely above a whisper, roughened by the breathing apparatus. "I'm here, little one. Did I do the right thing? Helping Mr. Vex'hai?" Dmitri was quiet for a moment, studying her face with eyes that held none of the cold calculation they'd shown in the council chamber. "You did exactly the right thing, Miko. You helped someone who needed help, even though it was dangerous. That's what good people do." The big insect men were very angry. They were. But they won't be bothering anyone anymore. Miko's eyes drifted closed again, the medications and exhaustion pulling her back toward sleep. "I'm glad you're here, Uncle Dmitri. You make me feel safe." "You are safe, sweetheart. You'll always be safe. I promise." Dr. Petrov watched this exchange with the kind of expression medical professionals develop when they've seen too much of the universe's casual cruelty. "You know there'll be consequences," she said quietly once Miko had fallen back asleep. "The Krythak won't just let this go." Dmitri didn't look up from the child's sleeping form. "The Krythak are going to discover that there are consequences for everyone, Alexandra. They just haven't realized it yet. And if they don't back down? If they decide to make an example of this station?" Now Dmitri did look up, and Dr. Petrov found herself taking an involuntary step backward from what she saw in his eyes. "Then they'll learn why humanity spent 10,000 years at the top of the food chain on a planet where everything was trying to kill us." Outside the medical bay, Station Omega 7 hummed with its usual chaotic energy. But there was something different in the air now, a subtle shift that every intelligent being could sense even if they couldn't quite identify it. The Krythak enforcement teams had withdrawn to their fortress embassy and weren't venturing out on patrol. The other species moved with less fear, spoke more freely, looked each other in the eye instead of studying the deck plating. In the council chamber, emergency sessions continued through the night as delegates tried to process the new reality. Some species were already drafting formal protests against human aggression. Others were quietly inquiring about trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. A few were simply packing their belongings and booking passage to anywhere else. The universe, as noted previously, has a twisted sense of humor. For 3 centuries, the galaxy had operated under the assumption that might made right, that the strong naturally preyed upon the weak, and that species like humanity were destined to survive more evolved civilizations. It was a reasonable assumption, based on observable evidence and logical extrapolation. The Krythak were bigger, stronger, faster, and better armed than virtually everyone else. They had conquered dozens of worlds, subjugated hundreds of species, and built an empire that spanned multiple sectors. By any rational measure, they should have been able to swat aside a handful of human civilians without breaking stride. The problem with reasonable assumptions is that they depend on everyone involved being reasonable. And humans, as Warlord Vex'hai had discovered rather emphatically, were not always reasonable when their children were involved. In her hospital bed, Miko Chen slept peacefully under the watchful eyes of monitoring equipment and the gentle attention of beings who had learned, in the space of a single evening, to see humanity in an entirely new light. She dreamed of old Vex'hai's grateful mandible clicks, of exotic foods from distant worlds, and of the uncle who had promised she would always be safe. She was 8 years old, recovering from wounds that should have killed her, surrounded by alien technology on a space station light years from her birth world. And she was, despite everything that had happened, probably the safest human child in the galaxy. The universe's sense of humor, twisted though it might be, occasionally managed to get the punchline right.